Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel. I'm the managing editor of The Point. Thank you for joining us today. The occasion for today's event is the publication of The Point's first essay collection, The Opening of the American Mind, which came out with the University of Chicago Press this past fall. Before we start, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the University of Chicago Press and the Seminary Co-op Bookstore, for their help organizing and promoting this event. There will be a Q&A period after the initial discussion. You can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window to submit questions as they come up throughout the talk. And without further delay, I'd like to turn things over to Johnny Thacker, a founding editor of The Point and the moderator of today's discussion.
So time is short, and I'm sure we all want to dive into the discussion. But since this is an event designed to promote The Point's recent anthology, The Opening of the American Mind, I'd like to say a few words about the magazine for those of you who are unfamiliar with our project. So The Point was started by 3 graduate students, myself included, at the University of Chicago back in 2009. And looking back, it was an act of naive idealism. We didn't have the first idea about the business of publishing, and we had no real sense of our audience, or if there was one. We certainly didn't imagine that we would still have an audience in 2021. We just had a conviction that there was a space for writing essays that were, on the one hand, grounded in everyday life and written with a personal voice, and on the other hand, intellectually surprising and philosophically challenging. And when some business-savvy person finally tipped us off that it would be good to have some kind of slogan, we settled on 2 phrases: questioning received ideas and promoting the examined life. But something unusual followed from those commitments, because we determined early on that The Point as an institution would not have a definite political position. Certainly as individuals, we had political viewpoints. That was inevitable and desirable. But as a magazine, although we wanted to play our part in bringing about a society where the examined life would be a real thing in everyday life, we felt that we didn't want to have a definite position on political matters. And that's because we wanted to challenge our readers to think through their own preconceptions. And we didn't want to be one of those magazines that you read in order to have your pre-existing views confirmed. So we decided that we would publish articles on politics only when they would genuinely challenge our readers, whether they be from liberals, leftists, or conservatives. And in our naivety, we hadn't realized how bad that decision would be from a business perspective. It turns out that political identification is a really strong motivator for subscribing to a magazine. But we also hadn't realized that that stance itself would come to seem to our various interlocutors as a certain kind of concrete political position. So starting in about 2013, it became clear to us that something had shifted in the intellectual climate, such that our mission as we saw it simply couldn't be grasped by some of the people we were talking to. To some, we were crypto-conservatives. To others, we were crypto-centrists. In the best case scenario, we were just unreliable allies in what we were urged to see as a cultural and political war. So what gradually happened was that we found ourselves thrust into a conversation about the relationship of intellectual to political life. In order to pursue our original project, a project of fostering the examined life via essays on things like love, illness, literature, sport, we felt that we had to actively defend 2 ideas. First, that intellectual life didn't always have to be disciplined to political ends. And second, that political life can be enriched by genuine intellectual exploration. And that's what led us to orient our first anthology, The Opening of the American Mind, available via the Seminary Co-op, around the diverse ways in which our authors responded to political developments from Obama to Trump. So the purpose of today's event is to discuss some of the questions that have occurred to us about that period from Obama to Trump. What has been the relationship between the climate of intellectual life and the political convulsions of the past decade? Has the emergence of a larger and more representative space for public thinking allowed intellectuals to respond more vigorously to political events? Or by contrast, has intellectual life itself been politicized in ways that threaten to contract the horizons for thoughtful and humane dialogue? So to think through these questions, we're very fortunate to have with us 4 outstanding panelists. Anastasia Berg is an assistant professor of philosophy at Hebrew University, and Jesse McCarthy is an assistant professor of English as well as of African and African American studies at Harvard, and both are editors at The Point. We also have with us 2 of the most interesting columnists at work today, Ross Douthat, who has written for the New York Times since 2009, and Agnes Callard, associate professor of philosophy at the University of Chicago and regular columnist for The Point. So as Rachel said earlier, the plan is to begin with about 45 minutes of back and forth between the panelists before we open it up for Q&A. And you should be able to post your questions for the panelists via the relevant button on Zoom. So my first question is for Anastasia, who really breathed new life into the magazine when she came on board in 2016, and who has co-authored some of the most important editorials in the magazine's recent history, as well as the introduction to the book itself. And she's currently at work on a book with Point managing editor Rachel Wiseman entitled "What Are Children For?", which concerns the growing ambivalence about having children and whether it's possible to overcome this ambivalence. So Anastasia, I want to ask you a simple but difficult question. How do you think that public intellectual life has changed in the last 10 years? And how do you think those changes show up in the book?
Right. So the book, I can say something about the title as a way of answering the question. So the book's title is The Opening of the American Mind, and it's supposed to be a reference to Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. And there are 2 senses in which we have been thinking, and we tried to sort of showcase opening, the sense of opening in writing this book. And the first one is the sense that the period covered by the book, which is the past 10 years or so, has really challenged us to open our minds to political possibilities that we either hadn't considered or that we haven't seen as vital possibilities. And that is manifest in a certain kind of political activism on the left that's manifest in the book and a whole section called After Ferguson. And of course in Trump and Trumpism. And we have a section of the book called Final Fantasy. And these are the kind of political possibilities we really didn't think are possible anymore. Something we try and capture by starting the book with a section called The End of History. So trying to capture that moment with Obama's election where we thought that life, at least kind of in a deep sense, is going to become very, very boring, and it didn't. So that's one sense of opening that we tried to capture. And another one that we try to less capture and maybe demonstrate is a struggle to remain open. And that's remain open in the face of a certain kind of intellectual bunkering. People talk about echo chambers or certain kind of closing down. I was thinking today in the afternoon about the term resistance and what exactly is it that people are resisting. And there's a certain kind of resisting to the other in many ways. And that's something that we've tried to both sort of write directly about. You mentioned some of the editorials that I co-authored with John Baskin, and some of the pieces that we published in the book in a title called, a section called Tired of Winning, where we tried to think as the editors of The Point about what it would mean for us intellectually to remain open, and what it has meant for us, which I think is something that uniquely that The Point has tried to really embody, is a certain kind of resistance to an attitude towards the general public that we see actually both on the right and the left, that have a certain kind of weariness or worse about the ability of the public to remain thinking, or the sort of fears of trusting the public. And if we have it both on the right in a sense of the public needing certain kind of statesmanly leadership, and maybe on the left a certain kind of liberal side trying to be, finding itself being drawn to a certain kind of expertise. So trying to really resist that and trying to show what we've always believed at The Point, that the people as they are have things to, are both capable of learning and are capable of teaching us things. So that's what we tried to showcase with the book, and trying to kind of just maintain a space in a place that seems to be closing down.
Great. Let's move on to Ross. Obviously, Ross, you're a columnist who's written about the role of political ideas in our culture for the last decade or so at the New York Times, a conservative among liberals. But you're also the author of a recent book entitled "The Decadent Society: How We've Become Victims of Our Own Success," which advances what seems to be a genuinely distinct thesis to the effect that most of us are just misunderstanding the cultural moment that we're living through. And I hope we get onto that in due course, but first just let me ask you a similar question to the one that I posed to Anastasia, which is just, in what ways do you think public intellectual life has changed over the last 10 years? And how have those changes affected the way that you have conceived of your own projects and responsibilities in public intellectual life?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you so much for including me, and thank you for everything The Point does. It's a terrific magazine. I'm very pleased to be able to suggest that people run to their local non-monopolistic bookseller and acquire a copy of the anthology. I mean, I think that the attempt at a short answer to your question is one that I think you yourself sort of anticipated in the opening, which is that insofar as intellectual life engages with politics, it's become more interesting over the last 10 years. I think it's hard, however real in sort of a profound sense you think sort of all of the different strange stirrings on the further left and further right are. For those of us who write about politics, they're interesting to write about. It's interesting to live in a world where, you know, you can publish, as the anthology does, an essay on neo-reaction, right? And, you know, the dark enlightenment and Silicon Valley people who imagine a sort of digital monarchy, and have that be taken seriously as something that's actually connected to real world politics. I think it's somewhat debatable how strong that connection is, but certainly there's more of a connection there than anyone would have anticipated, you know, in the first 10 years of my own career in the beginning of the 21st century. And similarly on the left, the sort of horizons of ideological possibility, whether you're sort of focused primarily on economic issues and, you know, sort of fascinated by new forms of socialism, or whether you're focused on the huge web of issues that sort of gets folded under intersectionality, there's just a bigger range of ideas that are considered both open for debate and connected to actual political realities, elections and votes and such. Everything else seems to have gotten worse for reasons connected to the fact that politics has gotten more interesting. As politics has gotten more interesting, it's become harder and harder to do any kind of interpretive work about the culture that isn't read primarily through a political lens. And, you know, I mean, I'm a newspaper columnist, not an actual public intellectual, but one of the newspaper's columnists' jobs, at least as I understand it, is to sort of keep abreast of intellectual and cultural debates and try and surface the things that a reader of the New York Times op-ed page should be engaged with. You know, the moment when the small circulation journal runs the article that someone who doesn't subscribe to small circulation journals should know about. And I've definitely found in my own writing, and I think you can observe this in other people as well, that when you do that kind of surfacing, you know, there's just an immediate leap to, well, what does this say about, you know, Donald Trump? What does this say about, you know, the looming threat of fascism? Or if for conservatives, you know, what does this say about, you know, the crushing liberal hegemony that's going to cancel all our freedoms soon enough? So the sort of primacy of the political has made talking about religion or the movies or sex or any of these things that are actually pretty important to human life harder. I'm not sure if, you know, how much of that is exclusively a problem, though, of sort of shifts in our politics. I mean, you know, talking about the movies has become less interesting because of the tyranny of superhero movies, which is not, in fact, the fault of Donald Trump, Mencius Moldbug, intersectionality, you know, or anything like that, right? Talking about religion has become, I think, sort of less interesting and more filtered through a political lens. I think that's because of politics, but it has connections to sort of underlying shifts in American religion itself. And all of this is happening, in the shadow of the transformation that the internet has wrought, that we're still, going back to that Obama moment, there was sort of this deep optimism that maybe some people watching this still remember. It's pretty hard to remember, about what the internet meant for discourse, politics, and everyday human life and connection. And that optimism, I think, are pretty justifiable reasons to shadow intellectual life as much as they shadow everything else.
Thanks. There's so much to think about in that. Jesse, first of all, congratulations on your new book of essays. I still remember where I was when I read your first submission to The Point. And I remember how I jumped for joy, because at that point we still had to hustle to get people to contribute. And then out of the blue dropped this near perfect essay on French hip hop. And then shortly afterwards, you wrote this piece for us in response to Ta-Nehisi Coates' Atlantic article on reparations. And I'm honored to see that's become the title piece of your new collection, which I think is out in a couple of weeks, Who Will Pay Reparations on My Soul. And in that essay, which is also reprinted in the opening of the American Mind, you express the sense that new possibilities were opening up for social protest and social progress, a third reconstruction, as some have called it, but that at the same time, there was an element in African American thought that has seemed to arise alongside or in the midst of these social movements, namely a tendency for intellectuals to lapse into a kind of despair at the intractability of structural oppression and the impossibility of progress. And it seems to me those strands have continued in your writing since then, for example, in your fantastic recent piece on Afro-pessimism for the LA Review of Books. So what I want to ask you is, how do you think about the relationship between those two strands in your own writing in the last decade? The sense of hope and possibility on the one hand, and on the other hand, the tendency to despair.
Yeah, well, thanks. It's funny, I remember, it takes me back to the time when I was first working on those pieces for the magazine, and we were sort of in the early days or early phases of what of the Black Lives Matter movement and Ferguson, and now we're wherever it is that we are now. And I think that it's you write things and you hope that they will have some that they will last in some sense, that you won't feel embarrassed by them a few years later, hopefully, and that they still seem useful. And I think that in regards to this tension, this question, it's one that, of course, in the African American tradition goes right back to the beginning. And there's always been a kind of twinned struggle on the one hand to try and show the possibilities, I would say the possibilities of the country in a certain sense. And I want to be careful here, but it's always complicated. There's so many interlinked struggles, but if we're restricting momentarily the focus to a national one, to the United States, there's a long tradition going all the way back to the 18th century of trying to think about how to keep a struggle going that calls upon the best ideals, the best possibilities that seem imminent to at least one conception of the project that's been undertaken in this country, in this nation. Of course, that's been undertaken against a set of background conditions and sometimes foreground conditions that give that do not particularly validate those aspirations. The history of Black intellectual life, I would say, of African American intellectual life in particular, has been one in which that particular role has always been rather fraught. It's also one in which one is constantly trying to figure out, on the one hand, what the sort of pragmatic needs of politics are, because there's an urgency to those questions. And that urgency has never not been there, and it's not any more diminished today than it was several hundred years ago. At the same time, one has to think about how you win a war of ideas. That presumes, of course, that you already believe to some extent that that ideas matter, that getting the ideas right matters, and that there's some way in which advancing and holding up the right kinds of ideas will, if not in the short term, in the long term, have the right kinds of consequences. So I think, there's always been this kind of tension and this conflict in Black intellectual life. It's nothing new. For the most part, I think it's been a productive force. That is to say, I think it's actually important and good that we have people who are who come forward and question overly naive promises. It's important to have people who come forward and say, look, just coming around and selling hope doesn't do it for me. It's important to have people come forward and say, just because certain kinds of rhetoric sound nice doesn't mean it's not maybe more important for me to force you to face some really brutal, especially if they're empirical, facts on the ground, and to insist upon those and to insist upon their specificity. And so, one of the things that I've always been mindful of is that there's also a particular kind of tension that attends to the role of the Black intellectual, where you worry about certain kinds of arguments and debates, in a sense, being instrumentalized in one way or the other. You worry about situations where you're sort of being pitted against each other in ways that don't actually don't reflect actually the underlying aspirations that you have in common. And so I really think that fundamentally, in some ways, we're in a moment now where the conversation, it may sound in some respects like it's very bitter, very tense, sometimes very shrill. And yet at the same time, I think in a lot of ways, for a number of reasons, not least, I would say, the fact that we're in a moment where I think the impact of the establishment of departments of African American study, Africana studies, and Black studies means that you have a generation that has access to certain kinds of knowledge, certain kinds of tools that they didn't necessarily have before, and that didn't have a certain kind of legitimacy in the way that they do now. People are informed, and I would say often actually in fine-grained ways about a whole variety of things, in ways that I would say even 20, 30 years ago, things were a little bit fuzzier on a whole range of subjects. And so I think it's actually a particularly exciting and good time in that sense. That said, at the same time, one of the things that I'm always at pains to do, and one of the reasons why I have appreciated and gravitated towards the point, is that it's especially important in our tradition to make sure that you're taking the long view. There's a lot that we have to grapple with, and the issues that we're grappling with are incredibly complex. And there's always been a tendency to reduce questions of race in American discourse to the most superficial point possible in order to instrumentalize them for political skirmishes of the day. And what happens, I think, all too often is that means that really substantive, interesting, and meaningful argument and debate can't really take place. And when I teach, when I study, when I read, when I engage in conversations, I say, look, if you want to talk about race, I'm here to. That's why I want us to talk about it, but you're going to have to give me some time. This is not something where we can't do it over Twitter. You know what I mean? I understand that people want to do that, and I understand why that happens. And sometimes, surprisingly enough, I think some things people manage to make the form work, right? And then even out of the limited capacities there, they find ways to get something out of it. I'm firmly committed to the view that actually, if you want to make the ideas stick, if you want the ideas to work in the right kinds of ways, you have to be able to have the time to actually do a lot of talking, a lot of thinking, have a pretty rich moment of dialogue, because especially on these questions, it's astonishing even today how much we rely on received wisdom that is distorted in a whole bunch of different directions. It's not a partisan issue as far as I'm concerned. It's actually an epistemological problem. I think we don't talk enough about the ways in which race is fundamentally an epistemological problem. It's also a phenomenological problem. Again, these are very, very complicated questions. They're philosophical questions in certain kinds of ways. And oftentimes, what we call the discourse often tends to do, right, is kind of strip all of that out and dehydrate it or turn it down into some kind of little wedge point to score points in one sphere or another. And then so much gets left out. And what I'm interested in is trying to make sure that we're bringing things in, more and more and more and things in, and actually doing a work of reconstruction that I would say is political and looks back to the original moment of Reconstruction. But I also think it's a time for intellectual reconstruction after a moment of intellectual deconstruction that's been fairly prevalent in intellectual life going back to the beginning of the New Left in the 60s. So I think that, that's broadly speaking, how I think about those questions. But we can get into more specifics if you want.
Thanks. There's, again, so much to think about there, and we definitely will come back to a lot of that, I think. Agnes, you started writing a column of public philosophy for The Point, I think, back in 2019. And that it seems like it must have been earlier than that, just because your column has quickly become such a central part of the magazine in the way it weaves the personal and the philosophical in a manner that's just exemplary of everything that we are trying to do and have been trying to do. And there's so much I'd love to ask you about, but one question is just about the way that you see your role in public life and the way that your activities in that sphere, whether in writing or on social media, have shaped your own intellectual development. In a recent discussion with Zena Hitz as part of the Night Owl series at the University of Chicago, you countered her thought that the mission of public philosophy is to defend a form of education that's in danger of going extinct. by arguing that new technologies have actually opened up a space for collective projects of truth-seeking, and that we may be on the brink of a new intellectual revolution as a result. Can you say a bit more about why you see things that way?
Yeah. So I didn't so much want to disagree with Zena that that's one thing a public philosopher could be, as just it's not mainly what I see myself as doing. I think that maybe I can look at the question from 2 points of view. The first is sort of from my vantage point, and then like inside looking out and then outside looking in. So inside looking out, what I would say is that the real pivotal moment for me in like turning towards public philosophy was becoming the director of undergrad studies at just an administrative position, but it means I'm in charge of the undergrad philosophy program at UChicago. And I think before that, I'd had this idea that being public with respect to one's academic work is like promoting it. So like you have some conclusions, and then you want other people to have those conclusions too. And so you promote it, which seems like a good thing to do, like a altruistic and beneficial thing to do for other people. But I didn't see what good it was going to do me, or help me understand anything. And I thought, like, you know, of course I'd like to be famous, but like maybe after I'm dead, I think is a good time to be famous, because then I'm not susceptible to being injured by the fame. I think people are very susceptible to being injured by fame on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the ideas can still help and benefit people, right? So like Plato's fame is like massively beneficial for all of humanity, right? So I thought I'd be a public intellectual like after I died, and then people would read my work and it would work out for everyone. But I think I came by being the director of undergrad studies and somewhat changing that job, like changing it into sort of the organizer of night owls, and organizing a bunch of undergrad. I sort of realized it was a way to do philosophy on a different scale, that instead of promoting a certain kind of education or a certain kind of intellectual activity, I could just be engaging in it with different people. And I hadn't realized that was a possibility until I started doing it as the director of undergraduate studies. That was really pivotal for me. I still see that job as my main job as a public philosopher and public intellectual, is being the director of undergraduate studies. It's not that visible to the outside world, but it's very visible within the University of Chicago and to my students, and allows me to relate to my students in really quite a different way than I did before. I think about the curriculum, right? I think about what people are teaching. I think about like what is interesting to them right now that is not in the curriculum, and try to do events on that. So that's sort of from my point of view. Now, from outside looking in, I would say the rise of technology has created a massive new set of coordination problems. Like the thing Jesse just said about like talking about race on Twitter, right? It's like cups are arranged in a pyramid and they're falling. It's like, how do we do this? How do we talk to people who are strangers? We know how to talk to our families, sort of. We know how to talk to people in our communities, people with whom we share interests, but the internet allows us to talk to people who we don't know at all and who we have no basis for knowing. And it presents us with like a series of Turing tests, basically, like, how do you prove you're human on the internet, right? And like a big thing is like profile pictures, right? Like I think they're pretty important that people have like their face. It's like, I'm a human, here I am. But then another thing is like emotion, expressions of emotion, rage, anger, praise, gratitude. There's a lot of that like on Twitter, I think, because people are trying to like play a human being on Twitter, right? Be recognized as human, right? And that's a kind of coordination problem. Like, how do we get along? So I think that's just super interesting phenomenon of people trying to do this. And I think Ross is right that maybe there was kind of almost like this initial over optimism that there was going to be this like reign of like democracy and pure rationality as soon as people could coordinate in this large scale. But I'm still optimistic that those coordination problems can be solved. I just think it's hard. We actually have to solve them. Like we can't just presuppose that they're already solved at the outset. That we all somehow know how to get along. And then I think the question is, what is the mechanism for people to get along when they don't antecedently know that they have anything in common. Like they might not even know that they're human, because like it could be a bot, right, online. So like, how do you get along kind of with anyone whom you could communicate with? And I actually think philosophy is the answer to that question. I think philosophy is a way of getting along. It's a mode of communicating that's perfectly general. But I see philosophy, you know, kind of in the spirit of Socrates as a way of interacting, a way of trying to learn or trying to know. And maybe to go back to something about, you know, you brought up the point as having this mission of promoting being open-minded, promoting the examined life. And it's like, even there, I mean, I sort of see it as instrumental. Like at the end of the day, I want a closed mind at the end of the day, right? At the end of the day, I want to know everything. And then when I know everything, I don't need to consider any other possibilities. I don't need to talk to anyone else. I'm done. Like I have knowledge. Okay, it's not going to happen in this lifetime, right? But that's obviously what we should all want, is closed minds. But not having to examine everything anymore, right? So I don't see the examined life as an ideal in a way that I'm promoting. The ideal would be no longer, I mean, it depends on how you think of the examined, but certainly the closed mind being done, having knowledge. Having knowledge is the goal of philosophy, but having knowledge is not being a philosopher. Then your philosophy is completed at that point, right? You're no longer a lover of wisdom, you just have wisdom. And so philosophy is the thing you do when you're trying to get there. And that's where we are. We're trying to get there. And so I see philosophy as a way of doing that. I don't have a strong view that says there's no other ways of doing it. I don't know any other ways. But I am like, I find it like tantalizing and inviting that there are all these people I can talk to and communicate with now that I didn't used to be able to, and I can do philosophy with them. And my own way of thinking is such that I really need other people to think with. So like I'm not open-minded in any sense. Like when I'm not talking, I just always think I'm right about everything until I talk to someone. So all these injunctions of like, be humble, be open-minded or whatever, they just don't work on me. Like I say them to myself and then they just don't take, right? But if I say something and then Anastasia will, you know, I'll write something and Anastasia will like comment in the margins, like, why do you say this? Or, you know, and then I'll be like, oh, right. But and it's like, why couldn't I have thought that on my own? I couldn't do it. So I see it's like this very fortuitous coincidence of my interests and like the way things are.
Okay, thanks. So let me just try and draw something out of there, because you say, so, you know, in the final analysis, you'd want a closed mind. Like the open mind is for the sake of the closed mind. And if you could be right about things and you knew you were right, then you'd want to kind of, you would no longer have any need for philosophy. So it seems to me that there's a lot of people that think they're there already. And that's kind of one of the issues is precisely the question of when, you know, how do you know you are there, but also how do you interact with people accordingly, and how do you write for people who think that they already are there at the point where they no longer need philosophy. So Ross, I wanted to ask you, because it seems to me like a sort of constitutive danger of like being a newspaper columnist, that basically you become kind of intellectually boring. Namely, you know, you just pump out the same thing all the time. People kind of know exactly what to expect. They come to you for their weekly dose of such and such. And, you know, basically you can slip into becoming that person who kind of has their views already. And then the week's news are just kind of grist for the mill as you pump out like another article. And I don't think that's true of you at all. And I'm curious, like how you manage to avoid that. I mean, and do you feel that as a danger? I mean, I think it's true of some of your colleagues, for example, if I may say so.
I mean, I would say I've only got 6 months left until I run out of interesting things to say. So, you know, every columnist should really only write for about 10 or 15 years and then should take a 5-year sabbatical at a monastery somewhere and then come back. So when I don't take that sabbatical, you should feel free to, you know, track me down and kidnap me and you know, take me to whatever monastic community the Point has founded by then. I mean, I would say that to the extent that I have any advantage over any other newspaper columnist, it's similar to the one that we were just talking about, that instead of Anastasia writing in the margins, it's the entire readership of the New York Times explaining to me why my sentence by sentence analysis of reality is totally mistaken, definitely dangerous, possibly insane. And really, I mean, people often ask you, when you're sort of a token conservative at a newspaper with a famously liberal readership, whether it's a real sort of intellectual struggle or anything like that. And obviously it is sometimes, but it really is a gift, in the sense that, like, whether you're in the business of arguing about politics or the business about arguing about the meaning of life, the whole point is to talk to people you don't agree with, try and persuade them. If you're particularly open-minded, be persuaded by them. And most people in my profession don't have the incredible good fortune of getting to write for a readership that thinks they're wrong about so many things. So I think that's a real sort of unique gift, and it applies obviously to anyone, liberal, left-wing, or otherwise, who finds a way to write for a often friendly but often somewhat hostile audience. I mean, I think, though, in terms of the point about people generally feeling that that they've sort of achieved the beatific vision already, and have their minds, don't need the open mind anymore. I mean, I think there are two ways of thinking about that, right? Which is that, from a maybe archaic philosophical perspective, the assumption, right, is that most people have not yet opened their mind in order to someday have it close again on the truth, right? People are in the cave staring at the shadows or whatever. And a slightly less condescending way of putting that is that most human beings are too busy with the ordinary business of life to spend all of their time interrogating all of their priors, the way people who read excellent small circulation magazines are inclined to do. So to the extent that it seems like more people are sort of closed-minded now, I mean, one part of it is that the internet has, like, given people who are, who sort of would otherwise exist in a more normal and much healthier form of existence, perhaps a sort of pre-philosophical form of existence, this medium in which they're expected to come online and have opinions all the time and engage in argument. And so you're getting this sort of dose of the sort of pre-philosophical mind engaged in argument. But then I do think there's also some kind of real failure going on, and maybe it's a permanent failure and we're just seeing it more from the internet. But it does seem like an awful lot of people pass through what are supposed to be liberal arts curriculum with some kind of, open your mind thesis behind them, and come out convinced that they have, learned the truth about the universe, and now it's time to close the hatch. So I think there's clearly some of that as well. It's not all sort of pre-philosophical certainty. Some of it is people who have the real sense that they've done the work, as we say, they've done the reading, they've figured things out, and now they're here to just explain and not to listen. And maybe I would be one of those people if I didn't have 1,000 Anastasias in my comments section telling me that I have not, in fact, grasped reality entirely.
Excellent. Now, to come back to something that Anastasia said in her comments, she talked about trusting the public to think. And Jesse, you mentioned the idea of, you mentioned the question of whether it matters to get the ideas right. You have a kind of faith that it matters to get the ideas right. And I wanted to connect that to Anastasia's thought about trusting the public in a certain way, that the public aren't there to be just shepherded by you or persuaded of something, but rather to actually be partners in thought. But what would you say to a skeptic who says, look, that's just making a mistake? I mean, ultimately politically what we need is for authors who are in some way relating to one of the most important political struggles of our time to be motivating people and to be pushing them towards political conclusions, and not to be kind of raising questions that might undermine the political energies of the time.
Was that a question to me or to Anastasia?
Oh, sorry, to you, Jesse. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I think what I would say to that is that there's a long history of those things working themselves out at the level of what the Marxists like to call praxis. I mean, I don't think that the ideas, for instance, of the Black freedom struggle are divorceable from a pretty intimate back and forth and feedback loop in between so-called intellectuals or political leaders or whatever the case may be, and the organization of quote unquote everyday people. You know, I think a lot of these things really at the end of the day work themselves out and bear relation to the situation that people find themselves in their lives. If the center of your social life and communal life is the church, for example, the Black church is going to be the major source of organizing potential, of political leadership, and a certain kind of intellectual tradition, and that's something that we see. It's just sort of it's an empirical fact of that history. It's not the only site, you know. I mean, it's all, you know. You look at the conditions where people are working, and the extent to which they can communicate in those situations. One of the things that you see today, for example, is the fact that there are more Black students in college, in graduate programs, right? And they have more opportunities that previously existed in much smaller numbers to do certain kinds of thinking. People are using the internet and using various forms of social media to constitute various kinds of reading groups and places to think together and organize. And those things have an impact and shape how different ideas how different ideas get traction. I'm not sure, maybe I misspoke. I do think in some sense that it's about getting ideas right, but I think what I mean by that is not that there is a final idea that is correct. I mean that there are better and worse ideas, which tend to be, in fact, ideas that have been forged under more or less pressure and actual dialogue, including a broader social dialogue, right? And so if a certain set of ideas is cultivated in an atmosphere, even if it's in a Black context, but that Black context is actually constituted by a fairly homogeneous subset of class, of social class, that's not really and that's not under the kind of pressure of folks from similar backgrounds, but that are not in that class position, then it might not be ultimately the best idea, right? Or fundamentally, it'll reflect some of the biases of that class position, for example. I don't think this is exclusively true of ideas simply with respect to questions of race and simply with respect to the questions of the Black freedom struggle. There are a lot of other, ways I think you can see this. You can see it generally on the left, broadly speaking. I think you can see it on the right, however one thinks about what that means. And so, one also has to, at some point, make certain kinds of decision, understands oneself, one's self-conception, what one believes in. There are presumably people who don't think that it matters what ordinary everyday people think, right? I mean, there are people who are not Democrats. There are people who are fairly contemptuous of, working class people, and think that, look, if you're smart and you went to the better schools and you got a better education and you therefore know more, your views should have, more weight, and maybe they should have the only weight. I mean, Madison basically thought that, right? So I think that,
that might actually,
sorry.
that might be a good place to jump in and get Anastasia's view on something, because I think you've talked really interestingly, Jesse, about the way in which universities have kind of actually armed people over the last 20 years with a certain kind of knowledge, especially African American studies departments, and the idea of. But you've also talked about this kind of question of the way in which the intellectuals can kind of take themselves to be removed, or to be socially removed in the first place from ordinary people, and then to take themselves to be removed. And Anastasia, you mentioned one of the dangers of closed-mindedness as being a kind of question of intellectual elitism within the ivory tower. So what I'm wondering is, what would it take to kind of overcome that? What would it take to overcome that kind of ivory tower view and then realize the kind of thing that I think Jesse is suggesting?
Right. So I think one helpful way of thinking about this is to go back to the book that we're interacting with in our title of The Opening of the American Mind, The Closing of the American Mind, Alan Bloom's book. And Alan Bloom lamented a change in the way that people were studying the great texts and the way they were thinking of humanistic inquiry. And he was lamenting the fact that people would not turn, the way he saw it, would not turn anymore to books of philosophy and history and literature as a sort of, a certain kind of naive approach, and treating them as something that can actually guide them in life and can give them a way of thinking through problems that matter to them. And we, in The Point, and I myself, John and I, who wrote the introduction together, we related to that idea, but we also thought that there's something fundamental that Bloom misses, and it's precisely what we've all been sort of trying to start talking about here, which is that he thought that that kind of ability to get from, whether that's intellectual history that Jesse has been emphasizing, or a certain kind of the philosophical activity that maybe Agnes is talking about more, he thought that that is something that can only happen in basically college. So he's talking a lot about how the magical and special time that is those 4 years that follow a kind of a dreary upbringing within suffocating domestic life, and is followed by the gray fog of professional life, with very few people remaining sort of intellectually active, and that might be the professors. And we thought that that is a way in which Bloom himself is as giving into a certain kind of closed-mindedness, and that we are thinking very seriously in the magazine in general about what it would mean to resist it. And so, in addition to, of course, this kind of work that Ross has been referring to well, and saying, well, this is a very, this is a very small subset of kind of activity that we are offering people. Not everyone is interested in opening very long essays and reading them. we've also, and we talk about it in the op-ed, we also point attention to projects like if it's bringing more serious humanistic inquiry to secondary education, if it's having sort of the mass increase in activity online, whether it's things like Agnes is mentioning, or with the pandemic, we've had reading groups and panels and attempts to kind of work with people in different communities. We have humanistic education that's happening in prisons. We have projects. We have a piece coming out in the next issue about projects that have been happening with the elderly. And so that there are a lot of these kind of individual attempts to show that humanistic conversation that's grounded in a deep intellectual tradition that has that humility of, I think there's a question here about how do you keep yourself from mistaking yourself as being in a position of knowledge? Well, knowing that there's a long history to everything that you're talking about today, which I think is a point that Jesse is always sort of, will always bring up, that is a very effective way of doing that. But in order, if I could be a little bit ambitious for a second, I think the point is not just to increase these particular projects of reading in different age groups. It's really bringing humanistic inquiry and that kind of the way that humanistic inquiry can adhere in our lives to something like, if you think about how therapy is perceived in our society, or sports are perceived in a society. And what I mean is that we do not think that everyone has to go to therapy. So we do not think that everyone has to see a psychologist every week. We don't think that everyone has to be a professional athlete, but we do think that everyone who wants to participate in some form or another in this way of being human, if this way of exercising your body or exercising your mind can, if it's a group session once in a year, or if it's through the university, or if it's 4 times on a couch in analysis, or if it's intramural sports, or if it's, and so that kind of capaciousness that these forms of human activity have, that's what we're sort of, that would be, if I could dream for a second, where I would want humanistic inquiry to be. So I agree with Ross, not everyone wants to be studying and questioning everything all the time. But the idea would be that it would be so much more normalized to seek out that kind of, just an opportunity to seriously think about the questions that we face in our daily lives. And if I can say one more thing, just because it sort of has been moving me in the past few days. As we mentioned, I'm working on this book about childhood ambivalence, and Rachel and I, who is my writing partner, have done a survey that we started sending out to people, asking them about the decision to have kids and why they decided as they have. And we've really been moved. I mean, really just emotionally moved by the sort of intellectual depth that people who are not our PhD friends, are not writers, and are not, they're not in these fields at all, have display when they come to think about this fundamental question that every one of us has to face, which is, are we going to have a family of our own or not? So just sort of helping people continue that kind of depth that they already display is, I think, what I would sort of hope for all of us.
Absolutely. So we have some questions from the audience, and please feel free to chip in with more of those through the Q&A function. But one of them ties in very nicely with what Anastasia just said, because it's kind of the flip side, which is what does the university add to all of this? Like, what's the special role of the university in this? If we can have humanistic inquiry outside the university, then does the university give that kind of discourse some kind of rigor or standardization, or something that you can't get in the small magazines and social media, etc.? So Agnes, I'm curious what you think about this, because obviously you said your main audience as a public philosopher is, in a way, the undergraduates at the University of Chicago. You also, I remember when you wrote your first column on public philosophy, in some way you were quite skeptical, it seems to me, about what could be achieved that way. So what do you think is the role of the university in all of this?
Not sure. I guess I think one really important function of the university is an environment of serious leisure. So Aristotle says that's what philosophy requires, studia schole, right? So schole, leisure, is also the word we get school from. But it's not just regular, it's not relaxation. He distinguishes leisure from relaxation, right? And it's a kind of excellent, a kind of focused, energetic, zealous, spudaias, you could translate. It's like undergraduate students, graduate students too, but especially undergraduate students, they're like full of energy and they don't know where it's supposed to go. I think universities are maybe the only truly open-ended aspirational environments for people that exist right now, the only open-ended aspirational institutions. The reason I think that is I wrote a book about aspiration, and in the book, I argued that there was no such thing as open-ended aspiration. If you're aspiring to value something or to be some kind of person, you need to have some grip on the kind of person you want to be. Otherwise, you're just flailing. Like if you just go to Europe to find yourself, you're not going to find anyone, right? So I had this thesis in my book, and then I realized it was refuted by the world that I was in. There is an open-ended aspirational environment, and it is a university. So I think that a university is kind of an ideal place, and it is shielded from the world importantly for that reason. I think the reason I sort of hesitated is that I think it's really supposed to be that for faculty too, and for some reason it's becoming less and less of that for faculty. I sort of think it's a little bit less of that for students are under a massive amount of pressure, more than they were. Like my students are under a kind of pressure I can't imagine having been under as an undergraduate. So that makes it less like scolae, right? Less leisurely. That's a problem. The faculty are also, we have to constantly project busyness, and even to ourselves. So there's this kind of busyness and stress and competitiveness. I used to think competitiveness was good until about 5 years ago. And then I realized how much it induces conformity, because, you know, so there are real problems here in terms of is there enough spoudaia schole at the level of the faculty? It seems to be being eroded. And then is there enough at the level of the students? But I think that is why universities are like kind of in the first instance, the place for this. I think, however, that you know, I'm sort of not in, I wasn't at least in principle so objecting to elitism and wanting to overcome elitism. Like that's not a mission of mine. Maybe elitism is true. Like if it's true, we shouldn't overcome it. Plato thinks it's true. But here's something I have found is that elitism is one of those views where if you have it, you find it very hard to hold it sincerely. Like it's like a theory that doesn't fully support you, and you feel that in Bloom, like reading Bloom. It's like his elitism holds him back from grasping the depth of the very ideas that he's trying to engage with. Elitism is a form of cynicism, I think, quite often anyway. And insofar as a form of cynicism, it's just at the end of the day not going to be an idea that you actually really believe. So I don't find it offensive. I just find it kind of hard to use, hard to live with as an image of your life. And universities, insofar as they are somewhat inclined in that direction, are undermining themselves as serious institutions of knowledge.
Okay. Yeah, there's so much that that I would want to go into there, but at the same time, I also want to raise different questions. So, Ross, there's a question for you, which is about trying to engage across political differences and how we can do that across perhaps even especially deep differences like worldview differences, religious versus secular, for example. And to put it in connection with something Agnes said, not just now, but before, Agnes kind of had the picture of like we're in this new social world. We'd like to get along, but we can't figure out how to get along. And it seems to me that there's at least you know, one skeptical thought, which is maybe people don't want to get along, right? Maybe there are people who really genuinely don't want to get along, and that's because they view themselves precisely as having the truth, right? Knowing already what the right thing is, and being convinced of the impossibility of convincing you means that they basically think you need to be kind of maneuvered in some way rather than participated with or conversed with. So how do you try to communicate across those kinds of divides of worldview? I mean, obviously you do it all the time as a Catholic writer in the New York Times.
I mean, I think it's a real challenge, right? And it's not one. I mean, I find if I'm sort of doing self-analysis that in order to have certain kinds of conversations or arguments, I tend to adopt a slightly greater ironic detachment from my own arguments than I necessarily authentically feel. Because that's sort of a precondition, I think, for arguing not about some sort of specific policy, but across a big worldview gap. And maybe the worldview gap is over some really fraught issue like abortion, or maybe the worldview gap is literally over, did God create the heavens and the earth or not, right? And so you have to start a conversation, you do sort of have to dial down the stakes a tiny bit, where you have to say sort of like, well, we're all sort of fallible human beings living in this, this complex world that's sort of comical if you look at it from a certain vantage point. And, with that as your backdrop, let's talk about abortion. Let's talk about theology. Let's talk about, these kind of things. And I worry that there's a little bit of dishonesty in that. I mean, not dishonesty exactly, but a sort of like that I'm sort of inauthentic in some sense about my own beliefs and how seriously I actually take them. So I sort of go back and forth on that question a lot. But like, it's, you can't, if you're talking to people who disagree with you in a deep and heartfelt way, there's a certain style of argument that you just can't do. There's no point, right? You're not going to get anywhere. So you do have to have a little bit of sort of irony about your own stance and your own worldview. But then that can be a crutch, where you're just sort of always, you become the sort of perpetually ironic figure who, isn't on anybody's side really about anything. And certainly I occasionally get critiques along those lines from some of my friends to my right, for whom I'm like, this guy out there sort of jousting with liberals in this sort of detached way, and meanwhile, the real work of politics is happening, and I'm absent from it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know, the sort of Socratic style of questioning, right, is in conversations, right? Like if I'm at a dinner party with someone, and they, issue I mean, I'm often in situations, I find, where people issue statements that they take for granted as a series of statements about reality that I completely disagree with. And I don't usually get into screaming arguments. I do very often engage in this sort of poking and prodding that might be more annoying than the screaming argument. And maybe they come away from it really annoyed by me, and they would appreciate someone who was just like, the Lord your God will judge you for those views, you fool. I don't know.
Thanks. This is great. It's really taken me back to the University of Chicago and Kierkegaard, ironic communication, and so on. So there's actually a question for Jesse that, in some ways, is a similar question, certainly complementary. It's from Kyle Cohen in the Department of Philosophy at York University in Toronto, who says that you insightfully call for a move from intellectual deconstruction to reconstruction. and you describe a problem space suffering from reductionism, denial of complexity, and the prevalence of superficiality that strips and dehydrates with the aim of scoring points in specific political spheres. But what do you see as the role of overcoming a deep disagreement in tension with the current widespread lack of skill of staying with the discomfort of disagreement? So I think it's how can we overcome a certain situation in which people are uncomfortable with disagreement, even though disagreement may be necessary to precisely overcome our to overcome the kind of dead end in which we're in and achieve the actual reconstruction that you've talked about.
Yeah, I mean, I think I understand the thrust of the question. I don't know. I'm of several minds about this, I guess, and I think it's hard for me to I don't want to be prescriptive about this, and different people have different experiences, and people have all kinds of anecdotes. It's been my experience teaching and working in the context of super elite Ivy League schools, that the discourse about the discourse that is sort of the way my students are represented, I guess I would say, in public discourse. There's some truth to it and also a lot of untruth to it. Again, but I can't speak to anything other than my own personal experience. So I don't know, it may not in the end mean much. My personal experience is that a lot of the way in which, from what you might read in the media, you would think that all of my students were hysterical about everything, and that it was impossible for us to talk about, anything that touches on identity. That, I can't teach without giving trigger warnings, for example. I do teach without giving trigger warnings, though. And I haven't actually had those complaints. It doesn't mean that I teach without consideration, and it doesn't mean that I don't put a lot of thought into choosing my words very carefully when I'm lecturing, and thinking a lot about the material that I'm presenting ahead of time, and crafting and presenting it in certain kinds of ways, and making it a point of my pedagogy to insist upon the fact that students are coming into a space. If you're, no one's forcing you to take this class, right? So you're coming into this space to be a part of a community. I make that, I try to make that very clear at the beginning of the class. That comes with, as a certain rights, certain responsibilities, right? And that we all share to each other. It's been my experience that, it is doable. I think that a lot of it depends on, one, to what extent are you willing to be proactive in some ways that establish an atmosphere of respect and of listening to students, and to being open to their input, into making sure that they feel like they're coming into a space where they are they're not, their sense of themselves in that space is not going to be dismissed outright. I think that's important. I also think, though, that, and I try to make this fairly clear in my pedagogy too, that while students have opinions and those opinions are interesting and important and often crucial to certain aspects of what happens in a classroom in various kinds of conversation, they're also there to learn. Like I have knowledge to impart. Um, their opinions about things, to be frank, don't always matter. That it's that doesn't mean their opinions don't matter, and that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be then go out of the classroom and be as vocal about those opinions in any which way that they would like to be. But I think sometimes one of the things that I actually think the university needs to make sure that it really is doing is not ceding so much ground that we're not doing the work of preparing students to go out and explore and test those opinions that they then hold in the world, because they actually haven't had a chance to acquire knowledge in the first place. And so there's some amount of philosophy in the case of the questioner, right, that's going to be about putting out an idea and having a conversation about it in class. I think that's important. I'm not saying that's not an important part of what you want to do, but I also think that, I mean, what you often find, right, is that in order to, before you get to that moment of dialogue and question and how they feel about this or how they think about this, there's an enormous amount that you need to do to be laying the groundwork for those opinions to kind of be informed. And, that's not easy. No one, I think, I'm not going to pretend that in the contemporary, political and cultural context that we're living in, these things are, easy. I think teachers, not just professors, people working in high schools, people working in grade schools, all teachers across the board, our society puts an enormous amount of pressure on them and doesn't give them the right kinds of tools. And oftentimes teachers are basically doing battle with, a fairly rapacious and anti-intellectual and vulgar commercial culture that makes our lives, that makes our duties to our students very difficult. But at the end of the day, you do your best to first and foremost impart bodies of knowledge. You have a responsibility to do that. And then, yes, of course, there's also an important, time and place in the classroom that needs to be devoted to, hearing and debating and all of those things. My experience has been is, in the classrooms where I think I've done a better or a good job of kind of building up a base of knowledge first for us to have a conversation, those conversations tend to actually be pretty good. But in times where I've kind of cut corners or I move too fast, or maybe in the early days when I had less experience, that's actually produced the situations where tensions in the classroom got unpleasant and not productive, because we were immediately going to people's engaging in a kind of war of position and war of opinions,
So
not
this
necessarily
is
founded on much that was very substantial.
this is probably a good moment to go back to Agnes's thoughts on, because there's a kind of a divide between Jesse and Agnes on the Twitter question is sort of front and center in my mind. We've got a question from James Dusterberg for Agnes, which is whether it's possible to imagine a form of public thinking that doesn't require the kind of commitment that being a philosopher or a scholar does. Is it possible to stake your life on questioning in a way that's part of daily life rather than part of an ivory tower kind of refuge from daily life in a way? So Habermas thought this happened in 18th century coffee houses, James points out. Could it happen on Twitter? Could Twitter be a place where people who are not professional scholars and don't have that ability to repose to somewhere outside of that maelstrom, could they be living out this kind of life of questioning on Twitter, or is that doomed because there isn't a base of knowledge that would enable these kind of discussions to have a rational form?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, Socrates did it. So what, one person, we have evidence it's possible. But you know, he devoted his life to it, at least at a certain point moving forward. In a way, part of the question is like, how much of your time is it going to take up, right? How are you going to make enough money to survive? So that's and I think it's a real question of like, how much energy do we have in the times in our life if we're devoting a lot of time to like submitting to structures of work, then what is left over? So that's one. But another sort of question is like, well, in order to be an intellectual, don't you need some kind of knowledge and training? And like what Jesse was talking about, like a base of knowledge. And it's something I worry about with being online for myself, is like, I kind of just get drawn in a million directions, and I'm like reading like 40 different essays a day on like topics that have nothing to do with each other. Some are in science, some are in history, you know, things I was never interested in before. And I'm like constantly trying to shut myself down and be like, stop going all these different directions. You need to pursue a question. And I really do think that's, I guess my answer to James would be, I think right now, probably no. And what would need to happen in addition to the manufacturing of leisure is that we somehow transform those spaces from being oriented around the value of curiosity and not the novelty of ideas, right? Curiosity is really quite dangerous and I think can be very unproductive. And I find it to be mostly a vice in myself insofar as I have it. And people confuse curiosity for sort of the real thing. The real thing would be there's a question and you want to know the answer to it. And I think there are going to be things where you're going to need to learn some things in order to make progress. You'll be able to tell when you're making progress. So it's like other people aren't gonna have to tell you, but you might need help. I think you almost certainly will need help. But I think it's really creating structures in which focused inquiry into questions that drive you become possible. And Twitter right now is a little bit too much of a free-for-all for that. And so I think of that as one of the big problems of Twitter, actually, not so much the, for philosophy anyway, not so much the other problems, but the free-for-all issue. And I genuinely don't know how we do that. And so when I said earlier that I think philosophy is a way of solving these coordination problems, but we haven't done it yet. I think we haven't done it yet. And so we haven't proved whether it's possible.
Can I say something just really quickly on the knowledge point, because I think it loops in things that both Jesse and Anastasia were talking about. I mean, my definite impression as someone who is, you know, not an academic, but I live in a university town, I teach some at Yale now and so on, and I read, is that the problem, the educational failure right now is less about creating sort of hypersensitive kids who can't, you know, who need a trigger warning for everything, and much more a failure to pass on basic knowledge to people who are notionally elites and should have the leisure and the time required to acquire basic knowledge about, you know, history, culture, and the history of culture, basically. And I think that flows from a lot of different forces, including the internet and Twitter, including consumerism and capitalism, but it also flows from a crisis of confidence in the humanities, in the virtue of the things that the humanities exist to transmit. And I think what Jesse has been saying about African American studies is really, it's really interesting, because that is an area of exception, because it is a place where it's so obvious how, you know, recovering and sort of deepening your knowledge of African American history bears on present day politics, maybe especially present day progressive politics, that there's a real confidence, I think, as an outsider, in the importance of that work and that knowledge that just seems really absent when you're dealing with, you know, medieval history or Shakespeare, or, you know, sort of going through a longer humanistic list. And I think there's sort of this internal lack of confidence. And then to what Anastasia was saying about sort of, you know, the transmission of humanism beyond the Academy and the small circulation journal, which, I am suitably rebuked in my, my limited horizon. But I think what tends to happen there too is that in the Academy, when you expand humanism, it often takes these sort of middle brow forms, right? It's like, the 1950s great books. It's like, here's the 10 books you need to read to be an educated person. And there's an academic tendency to, be suspicious of that and maybe even scornful of that. But that is how this kind of transmission and knowledge base is built, and how it at least begins. So I think you need more commitment to sort of transmitting knowledge itself within the Academy, and less maybe scorn for how that tends to happen initially outside it too, I think.
Okay, well, we've got a really interesting question that I don't think we're going to have time to actually get into, but we've got a couple actually.
Sorry.
No. We could go on all afternoon. I think with happily, but the question is really about what the role of charity, or perhaps even love, is in fostering a genuine dialogue. Right? The principle of charity. When do you extend that charity towards an interlocutor whose ideas you find disagreeable, or even dangerous? And the person says, I feel like I hear too many of my intellectual friends use the word enemy these days. And you might think something that I think we've argued in the magazine, the word ally ought to also be questioned, because it's a kind of military metaphor that may be out of place in the space of intellectual discussion. And that's something we've tried to kind of embody in the book and in the magazine more generally. The final section of the book is called Thinking Ahead, and it tries to point beyond the controversies of the Trump era towards new vistas for intellectual life. In the final essay of the collection, Justin Smith, writing in what we now know was the early phase of the pandemic, argued that COVID might shake us out of our intellectual torpor and force us to rethink our models and assumptions about the world. And we all hope that's true. I think today's discussion has been one in which we've been shaken out of a certain kind of torpor by you all. So thank you to all four of you participants, and please look up the book and consider buying it. You can get it from the Seminary Co-op bookstore's website, or your local monopolistic bookstore, as Ross said. So thanks for your time, and we hope to see more of you and have you part of the Point community in the future. Thanks.